Good afternoon, and welcome to today's presentation. On behalf of the Master of Design Studies program, I'm happy to welcome Kathryn Yusoff, who will be lecturing on Geo-Logics, natural resources as necropolis. As necropolitics, sorry. Before I introduce Kathryn, I'd like to make a few announcements. First of all, just a shout out to Paige Johnston, Kat Chavez, who put together this event for today. Thanks very much. And as always, Matt Smith on technology. I also want to invite you to join us for some upcoming GSD public programs. Tomorrow, that's Tuesday, November 17th at 7:30 p.m., we'll be joined by the Black Reconstruction Collective. It's a group of architects and designers who collectively imagine transformations to the built environment in the Black radical tradition. And on Thursday, November 19th, also at 7:30 p.m., Sheila Foster will explore how we might begin to think about urban infrastructure as a commons capable of meeting the social and economic needs of the most vulnerable of urban populations. All these lectures will happen on Zoom, as we are today on Zoom. They require virtual attendees to register, and you can get more information about both those events, as well as how to register if you go to the GSD's website. And then finally, just a quick reminder about some of the features that you'll see in today's Zoom webinar. First of all, we have a live captioning available for this event. To enable the captions, just go down to the window and you see the little toggle for closed caption at the bottom right screen. The chat function has been disabled so that we can all focus on Kathryn's presentation. And then finally, but we will have Kathryn be able to respond to questions after she's finished her lecture. So you can feel free to submit questions into the queue at any time during the lecture or after by clicking on the Q&A function, which is just to the left of the closed caption function at the bottom of the Zoom window. The past 2 years have been extremely productive for Kathryn Yusoff. There have been several publications and public lectures. I'll mention a few in just a minute. And in these, she's, over the past 2 years, argued in detail that the increasingly popular and powerful concept in the environmental humanities, the concept of the Anthropocene, actually exhibits fundamentally a colonial and racist geology. The Anthropocene, Yusoff argues, is a white one, what she calls a white utopia that necessarily and structurally constructs a Black inferno. The way she mobilizes this argument is by turning to the field that studies the relation of the human to the non-human, and of both to the earth itself, and that is her field of geology. For Yusoff, the principle of extraction, the principle of mining so-called natural resources, has brought historically, but also ontologically, the conjunction of a very another different kind of extraction, that is the dispossession of the very personhood, of the very humanity of Black people and of indigenous people. But rather than just indicting the concept and turning away from the inhuman and the inhumane, Yusoff in her work confronts the inhuman head on. Race is humanized as matter. By that, I'm referring to labor, but also simply the fungibility of the very body of slaves and indigenous people. Yusoff studies the inhuman site as a site of possible radical reevaluation. So the alignment of the inhuman void of the inhuman void of Blackness, and aligned with the radical alterity of the earth, makes Black and Indigenous studies crucial for her to thinking about the earth and to the environmental humanities. Kathryn Yusoff is professor of Inhuman Geography at the School of Geography at Queen Mary in the University of London. She's most recently the author of A Billion Black Anthropocenes, or A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None. That's with the University of Minnesota Press. And the author also of a forthcoming title, Geologic Life, Inhuman Intimacies, and the Geophysics of Race. As I said, today's lecture is entitled Geo-Logics as Geo-Logics, Natural Resources as Necropolitics. She won't be able to hear you, but please give a warm welcome. Join me in welcoming Kathryn Yusoff.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Michael, for that introduction. And thank you for this invitation to present in the School of Design and Architecture. I began life as a student in a School of Art, so this is quite a return for me, but it has informed the ways in which I've been thinking about materiality and how I'm going to talk about materiality today. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen with you, so that you can see the presentation. So hopefully you can all see that. And I want to just really start off this talk with a quick sort of intro, which is also a sort of digest of the talk. And this is from London grime artist Loki. And here he's drawing attention to the origins of the new iPhone in terms of the mining that delivers this smooth and shiny into our material communications networks. So the research I'm going to talk about today is taken from my forthcoming book, Geologic Life, Inhuman Intimacies and the Geophysics of Race. And what I'm really interested in here is the relation between racialized undergrounds and the material productions of the ongoing architectures of modernity, and how this production of natural resources initiates affective architectures of violence. So I'm going to say a bit more about this later on, but just to kind of think for a moment with the iPhone that's now equipped with the LiDAR scanner, and it's the first one on the camera function, and it's effectively used to measure distance and depth of materialities using lasers. So this is a bare earth technology that identifies rare earth minerals for extraction. So in this case, it's the mineral tantalum, which is the nickname for coltan in the Dominican Republic of Congo. So seen through the surface, as LiDAR technologies promise in their topographic mapping of geology, sets up the conditions of how undergrounds become visible and verticality is rendered in 3D in surface, in relation and service to the surface. So this is the first phone to employ LiDAR technology, and it's essentially making the phone into a miniaturized version of the very macro transformative technologies of extraction that are terraforming the earth, and geopolitical and subjective states. So the critical minerals that LiDAR is used to detect are crucial in the architectures of smart cities and the functionings of urban and green infrastructures. So this is a geosocial formation of extraction, and it enacts this telescoping effect or mimetic relation, whereby the technologies of detection and their bounty become miniaturized in the very digital technologies that drive the conditions of extraction in the first instance. So there's this kind of loop between the mine and the materialities of sociality, which I'm going to be talking about today. So this kind of really sets the scene for my question, which is it's quite a simple question in a sense, and that is, how are racial conditions of extraction historically and materially organized? The more complicated bit, I think, is how we map the affective and material architectures that constitute the making of natural resources in both their material, mythic, and subjective registers. Another way to put this might be, how might we think about an embodied geology and its spatial relations as racialized? So if we understand materiality as a colonial organization of the empirics and the praxis of matter, or what I call white geology, how do we begin to map these cartographies? So what I want to do is really address how natural resources have become the dominant and normative mode of matter, and one that is predicated on and institutionalized racialized relations. So through historically specific examples from the US, I'm going to talk about how natural resources instituted the global episteme of materiality as race, and thus is a category of geologic life that institutionalizes racism through paradigmatic and infrastructures of extraction, so both material and mythic infrastructures. What I want to show, and this is where the meme becomes important, is the relationship between origin stories of matter and the legacy issues of extraction in the geologics of natural resources. So everywhere we see the impact of mining, its ruinous afterlives in pollution, political unrest, and the social divisions it maps into, where profits head to Rio Tinto in London or float on the stock exchange, but little, if any, wealth actually remains in sites of extraction. So the mining relation here is key to this dynamic. What is mined to build up in racial capitalism, including the kind of architectures of our urban spaces, also undercuts and undergrounds. So Kili Membe's notion of necropolitics, developed in his 2003 essay, uses the term necropolitics to extend biological thought to talk about spaces of governance that are defined through the pauperization and precarity of populations and their direct or indirect exposure to death. So this would seem to capture something of what is at stake in the extraction of natural resources. Indeed, Membe suggests that the predation of natural resources is one such category, where populations, particularly indigenous populations, are displaced and eliminated in collaboration with state and international corporations. So I want to depart from Membe's use of necropolitics and its continuance of what I would think of as a kind of Western biopolitical mode and political thought, which foregrounds zones of exception outside the norm, to really suggest that natural resources perform a grounding necropolitics. So necropolitics as the norm. A globalized norm that is the legacy project of colonialism and the distribution of earth materials and changes of climate and energy states along these hierarchical categorizations of people, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. So I want to argue that it's not about critical zones per se, but a relation between the surface and racialized undergrounds that build urban and planetary spaces. So I want to talk about two historical stratal relations today. And by this, I mean the relations informed by an understanding of strata as this kind of geosocial formations that brings geophysical worlds and social worlds together. And talk about how these are being deployed in the making of natural resources. So the first instant I want to talk about is Louis Agassiz and his geographical race maps and portraits of the enslaved. I'm sure that you'll all be familiar with his connection at Harvard. So I want to talk about these maps alongside his scientific and political claims about polygenesis, plantation economies, and race. And while Agassiz's racial science and those of his fellow geologists have largely been debunked, it is very much the legacy of racial difference that endures and has a sedimentary power that I want to attend to today. And the second is to examine convict lease prison mines in Birmingham, Alabama, which helped build the Magic City. This example of the carceral form of what was seen as natural resources of the state, iron ore, and the invention of the category of black convicts who were leased to corporations, undergrounded black life during Reconstruction to build the white surfaces of modernity, segregating social space and disenfranchising populations. thereby enacting a stratigraphic imagination of racial difference, as argued by Agassiz, as a geography of both surface and mine. And this set the conditions for carceral futures and the structures of racialized undergrounds to come. So both these historic examples of past geologic relations are part of the politics of the present at Harvard, and ongoing questions around the legacy and collections of racist scientist Louis Agassiz remain, particularly his collections of geology. Similarly, the Harvard prison divestment campaign attends to the investment in prisons. And we can think about here historically how natural history and extraction contributed to broader issues surrounding carcerality and questions of racial justice, and what I think of as anti-Black gravities, or what we might describe as a geophysics that is produced by this combination of conditions of materiality and the policing of urban space, with the epistemic frameworks that produce inhumane conditions of subjectivity. So the collaborative work of mythos and materiality, instigated by figures like Agassiz, that produced racialized environments within the US and continued transnationally. So I want to consider both these accounts of materiality as a kind of affective infrastructure of white geology, or we might see it as a form of geotrauma. The point to broader sites in the racializing geologics of natural resources, and question how we might think about the decolonizing of matter. So I'm going to start with Louis Agassiz. And in the case of his photographs of the enslaved, Tamara Lana, a descendant of one of the enslaved persons, has spoken of the inhumanity, the trauma. So the inhumanity that Agassiz propagated was twofold. He fashioned the category of the inhuman as both a geophysical and a subjective category, crafting geostories of the earth and of racialized populations within the category of the inhuman. And he was also the most important geologist in the US and held a chair in zoology and geology at Harvard University. So while biographies focus on personalities and elevated white father figures, this often dissuades attention from the broader systematic institutionalization of race as a material, economic, and social differential, and its legacy of subjection that was made in institutions like Harvard. It is not so much the explicit racial work that is done by leading geologists in their populist accounts of geology and the so-called natural order of race as it pertained to questions over slavery, nor the letters to presidents and newspapers, or even the founding of scientific institutions through slavery, so much as the sticky residue of racialized difference understood as a temporal condition that had a phenotypical or aesthetic expression. This temporal difference that is still perpetuated in ideas of white supremacy, development, modernity, etc., is the legacy of paleontology. Paleontology was the joining of the subject of the earth and fossils, or life on earth, and pertained to these much wider geophilosophies of being. The emergence and consolidation of geology as a discipline and as a material practice of classification has a complicated history, which is both entwined with philosophies of life and actualized in the foundational material practices of colonial survey, which were material practices of Geo-Logics, whereby resource extraction and racial differentiation went hand in hand as a mutually supportive praxis under colonialism. The formation of geology is intimate to colonialism, capitalism, and slavery. As a philosophical discipline, geology is a history of ideas about the origination of the earth and being. Thus, it is both a kind of material and ontological ground. The French geologist Jules Marcoux, who was appointed by the Jardin des Plantes in France to survey the geology of North America and the English possessions, as they were called, in 1847, proclaimed, "Curiously enough, science entered America by geology. Marcoux goes on to say that there were scientific practices operating in isolation, but they were, quote, without the support of the people. Public opinion did not encourage them. This was not the case with geology. People in general, and agriculturalists in particular, and here we can read planters and enslavers, showed an eager desire to know the resources of the soils, the rocks, the mines. Geologic surveys were started at the expense of the state in North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, the New England states, New York, and Ohio. A desire to agree on points of classification and to know one another brought together the state geologists, who founded in 1840 the Association of American Geologists, the first national scientific organization. So emerging from this confluence of European American practices, geology became well established in the New World as a praxis of settler materialism and theory. As geography was the primary science of imperialism, geology became the primary science of settler colonialism. As Marcoux suggested, geology was the science of America because white geology provided the practical architecture of settler colonialism and the occupation of land and its transformation, as it simultaneously furnished the mythos of a populist race science of white supremacy, thereby enacting theories of racial hierarchies and difference and materially organizing the economic geologic units of land as property, mines, and plantations. Thus, geology was a populist discipline that mobilized and built white grounds. So Marcoux was employed by the US government to conduct a survey for the Pacific Railroad and became the first geologist to cross the US, making surveys from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean. After publishing a complete geologic guide of North America, he took up a professorship in geology in Zurich, but returned again to America in 1861 to assist Agassiz to set up the Museum of Contemporary Zoology at Harvard in Boston. He says the coming of Agassiz was anticipated with great joy, end quote. He describes Agassiz's visit to Charleston, South Carolina, and how the rich entomological fauna was a surprise to him. But, quote, what made the greatest impression on him as a naturalist was his contact with a large population of Negroes. With his power of comparing zoological characters, it was impossible for him to consider the Black man as a species identical to the white man, end quote. He continues to describe how Agassiz lectured on, quote, on the geographical distributions of animals, in which he insisted that every animal and plant is confined to a certain portion of the earth, while man is the only one who covers the whole surface. But after his visit to South Carolina, species, in his eyes, existed for man as well as for other genius, end quote. So while Marcoux suggests that we cannot conclude that Agassiz was in favor of slavery, he suggested, quote, this was an abyss which he never crossed. But it might be suggested that while he did not cross the abyss, he in fact created and maintained the abysmal fissure of the idea of racial difference. Agassiz's theories of Ice Age supported the French naturalist Georges Cuvier's ideas of extinction, and thus his theories of life, whereby fixed times of the earth determined the fixed times of species, which he extended to a discourse on race, whereby man covered the whole surface, but only white man and other species of men were designated to the category of non-human or inhuman and were confined to a fixed geography. Against Lamarck's theory of changing nature of organisms from internal and external pressures, so this kind of proto-evolutionary theory, Agassiz's theory of catastrophic ice ages was used to explain the breaks in genetic relationships of animals and plants from one geologic period to another. So blackness, in a sense, was literally placed in a different geologic strata and a different time zone. So in this context of extinction and his arguments of species in time, Agassiz produced the first photographic portraits of enslaved persons. Like Cuvier and the British geologist Charles Lyell, Agassiz participated in the signification and subjectification of Blackness within accounts of natural history, establishing the visual genres of Blackness and the defense of white supremacy through a geologic color line. The photographs were commissioned at Agassiz's request during his field work at the Benjamin Franklin Taylor plantation in South Carolina to support his racial theories through a taxonomy of enslaved subjects. So in this naming, Agassiz originates a genre of photographs of African-American subjects as an act of racial segregation through this narrative of geologic time. So there's several broader points that I want to draw from Agassiz's role in the formation of geologic knowledge. Firstly, the time of development of the discipline of geology, the grammar of materiality and its modes and aesthetics of extraction are contemporaneous with the violence of settler colonialism and the time of slavery. And second, paleontology developed precisely because of empire and colonialism, making available bodies and skulls and living exhibitions of racialized others as objects of scientific property to white men of science, in a way that was concurrent with the violence and volume of death that secured colonization through the attempted genocide of settler colonialism and chattel slavery. The plantation and the university were concomitant fields of power in the production of racial difference rather than divergence. So this kind of has implications for how we think about institutions of power as we move forward. In Agassiz's Geo-Logics, whiteness, being of the higher strata, could travel forward in time as a futuristic species, and blackness, being of a lower strata, moved in the other direction, stratified in deep time. And thus the division of what he called the civilized and the barbarous is made through geologic temporal distinction. Agassiz's racial maps used geologic difference to separate and codify races, while concurrent claims were being made for the superiority of whites in their intellectual capacities in order to justify the conquest of territory and the ability to escape what was seen as the confines of natural orders of the map and enclosures in climate determinism. So in these formations, white races were not bound by geography, but seemingly entitled to it through the extermination, if necessary, to achieve their natural tendency towards supremacy. So geology very much becomes an empirical means to construct whiteness as a territory that encloses property and subjects. So Agassiz's geologies of race demonstrate that it's not just about the kind of race politics of the time. So this is not just about how we address the kind of set of discourses at the time or the historical context, but it's very much about the race politics of time. So how time or temporal kind of narratives are political, and how geologic time was used to spatialize and hierarchize races in time as either extinct-oriented beings or future-oriented beings. In Agassiz's construction, race becomes understood as a formation, a process and outcome of geology. The racial architecture given by paleontology was not only justified and perpetuated in the theft of personhood and land, but gave impetus to racial differentiation before the law in ways that still define the struggle. Agassiz declared in 1850 before a meeting of the Association of the Advancement of American Science in Charleston, South Carolina, that races were, quote, well marked and distinct, and did not originate from a common center nor from a common pair, so i.e. Adam and Eve. So this is the theory of polygenesis that Agassiz propagated, proposing that human beings of different racial types did not share a common ancestor, and thus a common humanity, but were the product of multiple creations. So multiple kind of different material and climatic creations. So this theory of polygenesis was posited against the theory of a single common ancestor as a means to assert racial superiority. So if we look at the Dred Scott decision and the opinion of Chief Justice Tandy of the Supreme Court of 1856, it gave an inhuman classification of natural history, a judgment in law, through the construction of racial difference as immutable and fixed, using the language of geology and its racialization of being in a manner that Agassiz had campaigned for. The constitutionally sanctioned racism in the decision of Judge Scott, the Sanford case, found that Black African Americans, whether free or enslaved, were not intended to be included under the term citizen as employed in the Declaration of Independence. The dispossession was argued under the terms of natural history, collating a subterranean placement for Blackness outside the state, but within its borders. Judge Tandy excluded Dred Scott from the category of person set out in the Constitution, thereby justifying the continued exclusion from consideration within the category of the human. It is a judgment that sediments Blackness into its oscillating proximity with the inhuman. This placement was the juridical equivalent of what Kathryn McKittrick calls the uninhabitable in her discussion of geographical non-location of the plantation. Being outside citizenship, being property of and not of, quote, the family of man, in Dred Scott v. Stanford, places an account of Black sovereignty in the racialized undergrounds as suspended in a spatial and temporal limbo, without a rival in the political present. According to the Scott decision, the condemned category of inhuman property is recognized as unchangeable. This status of unchangeability was an effect of the when of race, as it is articulated through geologic ideas of time. So the stratal imagination of populist geologists such as Agassiz is clear in this judgment. For example, in Article 44, there states, quote, a perpetual and impassable barrier was intended to be erected between the white race and the one which they had reduced to slavery and governed as subjects with absolute and despotic power, which they now look upon as so far below them in the scale of created beings, end quote. So the Chicago Tribune at the time declared Tanley's statements on Black citizenship as inhuman dicta, while Dred Scott is largely argued on the basis of citizenship and who is designated to be a sovereign political subject. Its foundational reason and its empirical base is on racial difference understood through a stratal understanding of society, whereby the Negro is placed outside the polis and in a different epoch of natural history. So this is sedimented in the accompanying appendix of the circulated printed edition entitled Natural History of Species of Mankind by Dr. Samuel Cartwright of New Orleans. So in his role as chair at Harvard, Agassiz writes numerous letters to state officials, most notably several letters to Samuel Howe, a prominent Boston doctor and member of the Freedmen's Inquiry Commission. And the Freedmen's Inquiry Commission was charged with creating a blueprint for radical Reconstruction after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. He also writes newspaper articles and lectures on the inferiority of persons racialized as Black and Indian, arguing that it is a natural fact of the earth. Agassiz warns abolitionists in his letter, quote, remember that in destroying the power of the slave aristocracy, you initiate the reign of Black democracy. So the reason this origin story matters of Agassiz and his populist and institutional power is that understanding material geographies and how they're created and perpetuated relied on the inhuman as functioning as a subjective category. This subjective category was not a juridical or metaphorical category mistake, but it was a way to mine. So it was a way to mobilize the mine as plantations mined persons and soils for the extraction of sugar, and the fruits of the so-called fruits of the inhuman were a mode of accumulation in racial capitalism and the continued mattering of Black lives. So the figure of the mine and mining are crucial to geoformations of racial capitalism that impart a normative mode of extraction across material and subjective registers, which has subjugating and planetary effects. So the mine is the inverse of architectures of urbanism and their social relations. And now I want to turn towards an actual prison mine, to talk about these intra-subjective modes of material experience. So here's a photograph of a convict cemetery of the Pratt Coal and Coke Company that operated Pratt mines, where iron was mined with convict lease labor, young men and boys kidnapped by the state under the pretense of vagabonding geographies to racially clear social and electoral space. In the sparsity of these material traces, the inhuman basis of minerality often obscures and overrides more intrasubjective modes of material experience and exchange, the lives caught up in the mine and the furnace. In the cemetery in Pratt City, convicts like John Clark may lay. Convicted of gaming in 1903, he was unable to pay the fine, so ended up at the Slosh Sheffield mines, bought from the state for £9 a month. So working off the fine for his crime was 10 days hard labour. Fees for the sheriffs, deputies and court officials that derived their wage from convict fees added an additional 104 days in the mine. A month later, according to the inspector's report, John Clark was dead, crushed by falling rock. So building on the structures of property under slavery, convict lease labour extended the long arm of extraction over Black subjectivity, relocating power from the plantation master to the corporation, while reorganising gender and sexuality in historically new ways. Mineral modes of categorisation, steel, iron, coal, encapsulate the inhuman as a stable form of property for extraction, a lexicon for making non-historical objects rather than subjective registers. Yet while steel and iron come onto the track shiny, bodies of the incarcerated routinely disappeared into the heaps of cast-off matter at the shaft entrance. So there's a parallel inhumane grammar deployed in the property and category of Black life and material economies. Seemingly non-resistant to their passage, minerals, metals, and fuels make materiality available to selective narrations and the fantasy of elemental origin stories. Minerality worked in the underground is transformed into flows of social power on the surface, continuing the enduring structural relation of subterranean racial ordering. The microspatialities of race in urban space were vertical. As the mines went down, the skyscrapers of the heaviest corner on earth went up between 20th Street and First Avenue North in the Magic City. And race was made as a spatial effect of both the narratives of material redemption through the telos of development and modernity and the spatial architectures of the industrial city. Urban planning and the maintenance of hierarchical racialized relations continued to build worlds through the combined sociologies and geologies of race, as new aesthetics of steel and iron hid the hurt, telling a story of autonomous materialities of modernity. So the prison mine performed the material stratification of an epistemic condition of liminal Black understrata, a subterranean convergence of subject and material conditions. The Alabama Board of Inspectors of Convicts, in their biennial report, note, there were no records kept of these people. What had become of persons sentenced to hard labor prior to 1883, of whom there were absolutely no trace. They have disappeared as completely as if the earth had opened up and swallowed them. The very fact of their existence has been forgotten, except by a few at the humble home who wait and look in vain for him who does not come. End quote. So this inhumane life of a swallowing earth in subterranean worlds reproduced the weather of broader social forces. Geologists' reports became a crucial part of the boosting of northern investment and the development that naturalized industrial development and ideas of natural resources and their extraction, and the use of convict labor as a covenant of natural history. The coal industry rapidly developed in the 19th century, spurred on by the huge fortunes that were being made in that other Birmingham in England. In this mimetic correspondence of the co-production of coal and empire, the colonial scape of Birmingham, England, became a model whose success was directly funded by the £20 million of compensation paid to enslavers in the Slave Compensation Act of 1837. So staging the boom, Alabama newspapers speak to the wonders of the Magic City without mention of the persons that pass the transitional zone, the blackened strata of subjects that became the bridge to Southern and national industrialization. So I by no means want to valorize that labor in service of a national project here. Rather, I want to kind of point to how undergrounding young Black men and boys hauling, blasting, and being broken by rocks ushered in new possibilities for white industrial pride, narrating white working class masculinities and the settler family. Race became re-weaponized in the convict lease as a means to mobilize natural resources, and in 1898, Alabama attained 73% of its total state revenue from the hire of convicts predominantly to mines. And this is one of the mines, Slope 2. And the prison is actually at the entrance to the mine shaft, so it literally is a prison mine. So Tennessee Coal and Iron, which later became US Steel, was the first billion-dollar corporation listed on the stock exchange in 1901. It was the largest enterprise ever launched in America. It made 65.7% of all steel produced in the US and 30% of global production, thus solidifying US claims to the biggest industrial revolution. It capitalized at $1.466 billion. And US Steel's listing was the first billion-dollar corporation in the world. Its founders were Charles Schwab, Gilbert Gray, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, all familiar names in capital's terrain. So as Steel, man's servant, a US corporation film put it, when labor and intelligence is applied, US Steel builds the nation, because what would we be without it, end quote. So steel, automobiles, skyscrapers, defense structures, flat-rolled sheets, tin plates, tubular steel, railroad tracks, iron ore, earthworks of the settler nation. As capital was floated, the convict lease submerged incarcerated persons into the strata. The material structures that allowed buildings to rise in the air, railways to crisscross the nation, and Crossroad in Alabama, all upward push and outward expansion of infrastructure, was the sedimentation and consolidation of white settler space. The racial geologics of that gravity was built on the back of a black and disenfranchised strata that got pushed deep within the earth to ground these edifices of white supremacy and their floating billion-dollar shares. What held up also pushed down. Dependable as US Steel, so the script runs of material transcendence in the social text of matter, dependable as US racism in the color line of geology. In the materiality of settlement, coal and steel become part of the migratory possibility of white supremacy, making undergrounds that can move and grow. The projectile force of the extractive principle and carceral logic enacting secularism by depletion. Continuing today in its transnational reach, challenging the narrative of materiality as isolated from its corporeal histories, is one way to open up these historical geographies of the prison mine. So in 2018, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice opened in Montgomery, Alabama, as a monument to the victims of white supremacy. 800 rusting Corten steel columns hang from the roof, each listing the county and number of lynching victims, many categorized unknown or unnamed. Names and places drawn from over 4,000 documented killings by the Equal Justice Initiative from the end of Reconstruction in 1877 onwards. The suspended ingots mark materially the steel and iron industries that were fueled almost exclusively by convict lease labor in the coal mines of Alabama. As the walkway descends under the suspended steel, the viewpoint becomes subterranean, taking the viewer below the hanging bodies of metal to embody the view of a spectator at the event of lynching. An architectural perspectivism hangs the optic below the imaginary structure of a strange tree of life, the symbolic bodies of metal elevated as a marker of uncountable violence. The perspective is a lithic eye view, a story of the underground and the overground. Inside the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, down the street from the steel ingots of the memorial, stand jars of collective earth from the ground beneath sites of lynching. These differently coloured earths stand in tall jars collected by relatives or community members, recording geologies of racial violence. The memorials of earth and the hanging steel monuments connect the quotidian enactments of hierarchies of species life that were set out in 18th and 19th century racial paleontologies of geologists such as Louis Agassiz, George Cuvier, and Charles Lyell. This Black archive collects erasures of earth and challenges the violent acts of white supremacy in the pursuit of territorial claims to the surface and the political present. Visually mirroring the geologic survey cores and mineralogical samples that preceded Birmingham's rise as a magic city, the named jars insist on understanding the earth as inhabited. So convict lease labour promoted a reproducible model of racial capitalism while simultaneously enabling the spatial execution of social space, aimed at maintaining the white judicial command of the political surfaces of the southern states. Thus, mass incarceration served the dual purposes of attending to the fear of the reproduction of blackness in space or the black outdoors, while furthering the national improvement or settler eugenics of the nation. So Agassiz writes about this at length in his letter to Howe on Reconstruction. As an icon of American modernity and national pride, steel production was shaped by what W.E.B. Du Bois calls slavery's spawn, underpinning American industrialization and thus its modernity, as slavery had done for European industrial revolution in Britain. Convict lease labour became a way to mobilise the extraction of natural resources through the creation of a concomitant category of blackness as a parallel resource coded in human. As many as 200,000 people were forcibly incarcerated in the making of a mineral city. So racial stratas made urban grids. A magic city called Birmingham levitated from materiality, blackened lives, and black coal. This political presence sits on racialized grounds and occupied lands, and natural resources is the political script that uses the semantic field of geology to naturalize settler colonial violences. The politics of strata, then, in the mineral city can be seen as a mode of governance, of material surfaces, and of political time. The Earth's gravity is not just a metaphor, an allegory for the pressure that exerts itself on Black and Native life, but a material condition that underpins the imaginary of national projects of settler colonialism and future-orientated imaginaries of modernity. Political relations were enacted as spatial and subsurface enclosure. So these quieted social histories of the convict lease labour in Alabama show the emergence of a spatial and material fix for white Southern achievement, consolidated through natural resources. What starts as an experiment emerges as a proof of concept, placing Alabama as the richest Southern state. The intrusion into Reconstruction that convict lease enacted quickly turned into something with flexibility and muscle of a structure that could become applicable in other spaces and places, and had little to do with the fortunate geology of Birmingham. The lease, while signified through questions of labour and economic geography, actualised a crisis and curtailment of the polis, or political space. The maintenance of white surfaces in a terrain of racially segregated freedom had a verticality. The Southern descriptor of the problem denotes a certain politics of manoeuvre and prejudice, but it also distracts from how the convict lease system, the privatisation of personhood for corporations, was about the look north towards capital investment. Alabama's experiment becomes a key moment in the development of racial capitalism, and this late 19th century precept of today's prison industrial complex, which blueprinted a carceral geography that took its roots in an anti-Black ground and quietly expanded beyond the mine as a racial subsidy to settler nations. So it's not so much that the prison mine was just this kind of junior partner to the plantation, but it literally made the edifices of modernity, materializing the nation through a set of relations between surface and underground that were stratified by race. So I just want to end with a few conclusions and some questions for how we might think about this within the context of architecture. So the language of geology of natural resources stabilizes the material world and the operative zones of extraction and their subjective categories. It presumes a world in which geo-racial codes of value, stability, and circulation are already in process and not actually the site of origination of world-making and world-breaking activity that they actually are. So the take home from this for me is that there is no response to the environmental crisis and its architectural arrangements until there's a response to questions of racial justice, and how particularly white supremacy and its attendant structures of heteropatriarchy and class produce the effectual architectures of the material world as a necropolitical relation. So the question I have for you as architects and designers is, what kinds of undergrounds do the effectual architects of geology, concrete, steel, coltan, lithium, rare earth metals, build during their work on the surface? What kinds of world making are possible if we start with those racial undergrounds as a foundational architecture of attention? And see what they build and how they're tied to structures of subjection that require these undergrounds to build surface things. If natural resources are paradigmatic of a necropolitical relation, what responsibilities emerge in the building of worlds and the fabricating of urbanism? What if we begin our analysis of architecture through what and who has disappeared in the process of development and building? So what I'm suggesting is that we think through urbanism as conditioned through its shafts and extractions, to understand urbanism as something that takes away as well as gives, and to look at these residual architectures rather than the built environment. So if architecture is understood as an effectual architecture that continues to roll racial effects into the axis of extraction, then it's not just externalized costs and commodity chains of material sourcing that need attention, but the very arrangement of the foundational architectures of geoforces, what might be called geopower, and the crucial need for redistribution of geopower in the legacy issue of natural resources. So given the overriding emphasis in architecture on the built surface of the earth, if we look at extraction sites rather than buildings, not just then we can think alongside the historic racialized politics of strata that requires a black and brown underground. And we can think a kind of built environment of colonialism in reverse. So to decolonize the architectures of futurity and understand ruination as a path to somewhere else. So I'm going to leave you with this question and challenge of forging an anti-racist praxis for effectual architectures of change in your own practice. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much, Kathryn. That was really, really interesting, difficult, and difficult not to understand at all, but difficult to continue to think about. And a lot of the questions, which I'll come to in a second, let me just say a lot of the questions are going to ask you to think an extension of the sort of history of mining and the racialization of the racialized practices that come from mining, and to extend those into the present, especially a couple of people mentioned the idea of essential workers in the pandemic, in the viral pandemic that we have now, or frontline workers tend to be also, at least in the States, often the meatpacking workers tend to be also a lot of African-American people are also put in danger in the pandemic. And if that is somehow an extension of the history of endangering people in the mines. So we'll come to that. I want to just grab on your last challenge to architects for a second. I mean, certainly we're aware that as a profession, architecture as racist as you have shown geology to be. It not because it deals with time as deep as geology, but in terms of labor practice, material, as you mentioned toward the end, but also some expressive forms can be racialized. Famously in Chicago, architects called eclecticism a kind of miscegenation, a kind of interracial mixing of styles, was thought in purely racial terms. But on the other hand, I was thinking what's very different from architecture, from geology, is that at least not thinking of it as a profession, but thinking of it as an art form or a cultural production. It wears its artifice on its sleeve in a way that geology tries to deny. I would say architecture, literally as a construction, is also almost like philosophy in its attempt to reveal itself as a construction. It's only as most modern art does, I suppose. That this part of the joy of architecture is its constructiveness as not as a material form, but as a theoretical object. And I'm wondering if that self-awareness of artifice is something that separates cultural productions like architecture from geology as a profession attempt to hide the constructiveness, or to become quote unquote science in the sense of being objective rather than artificial. Now, you wrote a short piece on Robert Smithson, and I'm wondering if Smithson as an artist somehow could ever be seen as moving toward what you call, I think, an effectual architecture or an effectual art, moving towards something that's more liberative, or at least opens up questions rather than closes them down. Would you ever allow that?
Would I allow? I don't know whether I get to allow.
Allow us to think that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I in a very literal way, I do think of architecture is geology. I mean, it's like, it's kind of, it is bits of rock, bits of the earth, bits of, and so when I talk about geology, I'm talking in a very broad sense rather than the kind of narrowing of a kind of disciplinary field. But I think, I'm going to kind of go back maybe to something you said at the beginning about, how do we think about these kind of racial undergrounds as kind of all over the place? And that's what I was trying to sort of prompt us to do, is to think about how the sort of prison mine as a way of both funding the state through the kind of corporization of people, it does get reproduced all over the place. And the mine kind of actually comes onto the surface and into the city in all sorts of ways. Like Francois Vergès has done some really great work about kind of cleaners and racial capitalism, and, who cleans the buildings, who kind of keeps the surfaces shiny and so on. So I think what I wanted to do is pull us away from the way in which geology is presented, or the kind of the aesthetics of geology are presented as this kind of elemental form that is not touched by the kind of very processes of kind of embodiment that produces it. And I think you're right, Smithson does open up that kind of effectual architecture in his work. It's a very long time since I thought about Robert Smithson or read about him, but certainly, I think kind of thinking with Francois Vergès, kind of, who cleans the buildings, who kind of like keeps and maintains the surfaces that allow us to think of this kind of autonomous materiality. So what I want to push against is that sort of idea of the elemental and the idea of kind of materiality as dispossessed from these kind of racial structures, and to say that geology in its very inception is a way of making worlds and making kind of material worlds and subjective worlds.
There were two questions. I'm not going to. They're very very long questions, and I'm going to paraphrase them. But basically, that two questions that get at the same thing, which is, given the history of the practices and disciplines you're talking about, stipulating the racist histories, why do we have to think that history has to also be our future or even our present? Is there a way of deconstructing, of finding contradictions, of somehow opening it up? The story you tell, to me, seems suffocatingly closed. It's almost like we can't move out of it. And I think two questions, and I'm trying to figure out a way too. How can we find different logics that allow us to crack? I mean, just documenting and telling the story is already to some extent to free us of it, but not really, because we do feel sort of indicted by the very history of our own disciplines.
I mean, I think that in sort of telling those histories and actually connecting them up to what's happening in the institution at Harvard and the various lawsuits that are active at the moment, I wanted to show their kind of presence, but also how we might kind of break, I don't want to just throw a rock at geology and, sort of break windows, but actually think about how we break open these kind of structures of natural resources and actually make natural resources seem far less kind of self-evident than they appear to be. And so one of the ways, in thinking about the sort of sites of ruination, so thinking about, okay, if we think about architecture and buildings through the various shafts and sites of extraction through which they come, and we put that at the center, what kind of architecture does that give us? So, that's one way of kind of mapping that cartography.
Yeah. No, that's very helpful.
And to think about that in the life of a building, as who is maintaining the building, who are the security guards, who are the cleaners, who are the people that actually are actually keeping that building going, and what are the streams and flows of capital, of racial capital, that move through that space.
It's interesting. Our students are definitely becoming more and more interested in being aware and taking into account the materials and where the materials come from, and what is the cost in human terms or in ecological terms, material terms. What are the costs of not just the cost of the materials, I mean, the larger cultural, social cost as well. So Jenny Gang is an architect on our faculty and an architect in Chicago, and her work, she was one of the first to actually begin to take those things into account in the materials that she deals with. And what's interesting is she's led to certain forms and certain qualities of expression that are very positive as a result of thinking through that. So that's very helpful. There's another question. I'm going to paraphrase, wanting some more information on how the theory of evolution, like we know that Agassiz was not a Darwinian. He was not an evolutionist. Does the theory of evolution in its different permutations fit into the story that we were telling of Agassiz and geology, or does it stand as against some of the things that Agassiz was propagating?
Yeah, I mean, Agassiz was very anti-evolutionary thought, sort of prior to Darwin in Lamarck's theory of, and this is what the point I was trying to make about his notion of fixed races was kind of the idea that people are fixed in their kind of geographical space, apart from whiteness, and whiteness kind of has this ability to transcend. So I was trying to make the connections sort of in terms of metaphors between the sort of transcending city and the kind of magic city in Birmingham that goes up as the mines go down, and kind of Agassiz's notion of a kind of transcendental whiteness that is able to kind of move around the globe and claim land and persons and kind of and use this as a similar kind of mine. So he's very anti-evolutionary thought, and I think something there's a shift that happens later into a kind of the biologism and the kind of really sort of focus on life, and geology kind of becomes backgrounded in a sense, even though it's kind of created the very structures of life through this kind of pairing of paleontology of beings and theories of the earth. And we don't really see the return of geology until the Anthropocene, when it suddenly becomes foreground, and it's just like, okay, so now we have to think about the earth again, and we have to think about like materiality as actually being material, not virtual, not kind of, and to think about these flows and forms of kind of geophysical infrastructures, essentially, that support kind of forms of life.
Mm-hmm. And you may have actually just answered the next question I was going to ask, which is with the understanding of how blackness becomes a kind of, as you call it, blackness is also it has the principle of extraction imposed upon it in a very direct way in your argument, and the question is how in more detail does indigeneity or an indigenous people fall into that logic, when in fact what normally happens when they're colonized it's understandable, but when they're displaced, as they were in America, when they're driven out of their place, how does the logic work in that case? The tie to extraction and yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that that displacement in pursuit of, if we can think about kind of colonialism originates in the desire for natural resources, and that displacement is eradication of a whole set of relations. So it kind of implants this kind of particular interpretation of materiality as natural resource, and actually seeks to cut all the kind of connections and forms of living and kind of production of life and land as being integral to life, that situates indigenous populations. And we look at kind of what's happening now around or has happened around the kind of indigenous process, very much around mobilizing a kind of question of water is life, refusing the kind of imposition of natural resources, and this kind of codification of geology through this kind of extractive register. So I think you can see that extraction as kind of both sort of it's a metaphysical as well as a kind of geophysical extraction, and those two things kind of go hand in hand. So I mean, that ongoing structure of settler colonialism, is about kind of extracting both from indigenous and native life and kind of creating, I think, these kind of blackened undergrounds. So I see that as a completely conjoined process. It has very different sort of things going on in that process, but it's conjoined through colonial extraction.
And maybe this will be the last question. where would a theory of class come in, or do you not need? So if you have with the issue of Blackness or indigenous people, you don't need a theory of class, a more Marxist approach. You have an economic approach. It's still materialist in that sense, but it's not class based. Does that just become methodologically something you don't have to deal with, or can you deal with it?
I mean,
in other words, and sorry, and just say, and I guess in particular, let's say a white population who's very poor and dispossessed in some way, where in that case would you need class to account for that?
I mean, I think you can't account for class unless you account for race. So, not to mention his name again, but, in kind of Trump digs coal and the kind of re-narrativizing of coal as a kind of, as a sort of materiality of white supremacy, for example, you can't understand that sort of class relation without understanding a racialized relation. So I wouldn't want to separate these. I would want to see them as kind of what I'm trying to say about racial undergrounds is a kind of portal to understand a whole set of race, class, gendered relations. And I think, I think this, when you were asking before about how we break open, if we look at kind of what Black feminists and Afrofuturists are doing, they're absolutely taking on the mantle of time travel and the engagement with narratives of temporality as a way to think about kind of how you move out of that sort of bind of kind of material conditions.
Yeah, and I think there was a last question about globalization being a kind of possible opening, but I think what you just said about the Black feminists who deal with the temporalization and can also deal similarly with the globalization of culture. I think that would be an answer. I'm going to mention just once again to look for the forthcoming book, Geologic Life in Human Intimacies and the Geophysics of Race. And then also, if you haven't, I think most of us have the Billion Black Anthropocenes or None from Minnesota Press. Kathryn, it was an absolute pleasure to meet you, to listen to you. Thanks so much for coming out, and thanks for the information on Agassiz as well. It was very appropriate, and it was very exciting. It's a very exciting talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.